So, my name's Jeremy Allison. I work in the open source program office at Google, and that's the last time I'm going to use the word Google. Oh no, I did it again. So I'm here on behalf of Samba and mainly myself. So, there should be a disclaimer on there. All opinions and this talk are absolutely bugger all to do with Google. So, there you go, I've done my disclaimer. So, the talk is called Everything You Wanted to Know About Samba But Were Afraid to Ask. So, Ted actually pointed out, Ted Hager there, pointed out a really, really good question to me. He said, are there any questions that people are afraid to ask about Samba? So, I thought I'd throw that out to the audience. Does anyone have any questions that they've been afraid to ask about Samba? You don't have to ask me them now. You just have to put your hand up if there were any. Oh, okay, cool. All right, so at least it's not a completely mistitled talk. I asked Leslie, who also works with me, what kind of a talk I should give, because I'm preparing a very, very technical talk about the internals of Samba 3.2 for Samba XP in Germany next week, and she said, don't do that one. She said, do something a little more fun. So this is actually a talk I gave, I've only given once before, at the Computer History Museum down in Mountain View. Has anyone here seen that talk? Ah, damn. Well, you can go. I updated a few slides, but it's pretty much the same talk. But you could ask some more questions if you wanted to. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about the history of Samba and some of the fun things about the creation of Samba and about the people involved. And I'm kind of opening the kimono a bit. These are some of the things that we don't often talk about in public, sometimes because, they were really, really secret at the time. Other things we don't talk about because they're really, really embarrassing. So, you get to see some of the laundry being washed, as it were. So, from humble beginnings, crap. Now, you can't really see the pictures terribly well, and half the humour in the talk is actually in the pictures, so you're going to have to squint. So there's a picture of Tridge, a man with abnormally large hands, as far as I can tell, sort of like cartoon-style hands. The dog is actually a miniature poodle there. So he was, as Australia's smartest man, he was stuck in the middle of doing gravity wave research and inventing rsync, and he was kind of lost for something to do on an afternoon. So he decided that he was going to try and make a Sun workstation talk to a DEC Pathworks box. He really, really didn't want to work on his thesis, so he ended up doing that instead. Tridge's theory, actually, is that most open source software projects are actually started by procrastinating PhD students. And I can actually believe that. I think Linus started a little early, but I think a lot of the other stuff fits. So, the very first version of Samba wasn't really much what you would recognize today. He used SockSpy and Emacs as his main tool. SockSpy was basically a very early packet sniffer. And he wanted to get his Pathworks client to talk to a Sonos server and tried to work out what the protocol was. And the initial licenses was very, very common in the time. It was kind of a shareware license, no commercial use. I don't think he'd actually come across the GPL yet. By the way, if there are any questions you want to ask, please stick your hand up and ask them. I'll try and answer them as best I can. All right, I'll hold it nearer my mouth. Sorry about that. There's nothing worse than having a speaker up here blathering on while the audience, falls asleep, or like Ted there does his email quietly, from the laptop gallery at the back. So please interrupt. So meanwhile, in Silicon Valley, that actually was the Samba Man picture that was created after a Slashdot comment. You can't see it very well there, but I have the negatives, thank God. So no one else gets to show that one. I was at a small startup called Vantiv here in the Valley, and I just quit Sun, where for my sins I had to support PCNFS. Anyone here use PCNFS? Yeah, okay, so you feel my pain, right? Yeah. And undoubtedly, you felt some of Sun's. That thing sucked. I mean, really, really sucked. So we were developing software that had to run on Windows, and I was fed up of FTPing the files back and forth to compile them because PCNFS didn't work. So I thought of, I actually decided I was going to work on something more reliable. I thought, what about I ran into a Microsoft rep at a conference and said, you bastards, why is your file serving protocol proprietary? He said, it's not proprietary, we have a spec. Look, and he gave me the reference. And you know what? He was right. It was documented. So I started writing some code in God's own language, which is C++, of course. And then Tridge posted his code on the net under the GPL, and his was in C, but he was further along than me. So I ended up throwing my stuff away and joining in with him. It was actually a guy, I think, called Dan Shearer in Australia who first showed Tridge the GPL and kind of explained it to him. And so Tridge dropped his non-commercial use license and switched over to the GPL. And we've never really looked back. So the first GPL version of Samba was something called NB Server that Tridge posted. So I think he actually started writing it in about 91. And then, because it was a no commercial use license, nobody picked it up. And then I think it was about early 93 that he finally posted a GPL version after the code had sort of lain fallow for about 9 months. And at that point, I recognized that this was what I needed to make my life at Vantive a lot easier. So I started working on it with him. It had an SMB server and an SMB client. SMB server has been changed. SMB client is still with us, and much of the same code, or at least the early structure. Think about how much that sucks to maintain. About 6,000 lines of code. We're now, I believe, about 600,000 lines of code, and getting more as stuff is auto-generated. And it had no socket initialization stuff. It only ran from inetd. So my first patch actually was to fix that, because I didn't like having to configure inetd on all the machines I ran. And to be honest, because Tridge at this point was actually a DOS programmer, and his socket code sucked. I can say that now because he's like 1,000 times better than I am. But he was learning at that point. I should have known better. So we started working on it. We got Carl Auer, who was a programmer at Australian National University. He started writing the first man pages. We were beginning to become a package. We didn't have any delusions of grandeur at that time. We were just doing stuff to make our lives easier. So Carl also wrote the .ini style parser, which is based on the old sort of Windows 3 and Windows 3.1 ini style files that we still suffer from today. Much of that code is still around, being fixed up a lot, of course. And then I think I've sent the first patch into Tridge, and the second person was a chap called Volker Lendecki, who now runs his own business in Germany, supporting Samba, has contracts from IBM, a bunch of big companies, and he's running the Samba XP conference that we have every year in Germany. I'll be going to next week. So if anyone wants to hear the really technical talk, you can go to Göttingen and listen to that one. Volker has sort of built a small number of European Samba team members around him. And at the moment, because I've spent the last 3 months being a lobbyist against OOXML, he's actually probably doing most of the work in Samba right now. I'm trying to get back on track. So as I mentioned, I ordered the Xopen CAE Common Application Environment, I believe, specification from the Open Group. It was about $200, which was actually pretty pricey at the time. And at that point, it's like, oh, okay, we have documentation. We can start implementing stuff. So we actually began to learn more about the protocol at that point. So SMB is kind of weird because it has a text-based protocol negotiation string as one of the very first packet. The client offers a list of protocol dialects that it understands, and the server picks one, and that's the one that they speak. So we first started with a very basic protocol which was called Core, and then we kind of Tridge and I played Protocol Leapfrog for a while, just sort of fixing the various versions up. I added Core Plus, Tridge added Landman 1, I added Landman 2, and right now we're trying to work out, we're working on the SMB2 protocol level, which is actually a completely different protocol, just tunneled over the same TCP port. This is Microsoft's new version of SMB to take over the world, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. So we actually, the more we worked on it, the more reliable things got, the more things worked from Windows clients. But the nice thing about the protocol and the Windows clients is even if you first negotiated, even with Windows NT clients, if your server only negotiated core, then the clients would only send core requests. So it was a nice way of keeping the code quite simple in the beginning and not, essentially you didn't have to implement everything in order to have a working server. Of course, that changed later on, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. So the one thing that really bugged us for a long time was long file name support. Because, if you're running DOS and Windows 3.x clients, you've got 8.3 names, and that worked fine, that worked very well. Problem was, we had long file names on the Unix side that we wanted to show to the clients, and we had long file names, especially in the C++ code I was working with at Vantiv, we had long file names on the clients that we wanted to port over, and having to mangle everything into 8.3 was getting increasingly irritating. Problem is, the part of the spec that I bought that talked about long file names essentially said, here are some more info levels, and these are level-dependent structures, I believe was the text that was used. And it said nothing more about it. Essentially, it was like a here be dragons spot in the protocol spec. Now, we knew that Windows clients could do it because when we went Windows NT to Windows NT, we could see long file names. So we knew that there was a method to make this work. So I actually had a brainwave. I was off with flu, so I was avoiding Vantiv work for a while, and I was sat at home with my Sun 386i on one side and my Windows PC on the other, sneezing onto the keyboard. And I suddenly realized that OS 2 was the first version of a Windows style, I suppose. So remember, it was Microsoft OS 2 back in those days. It was the first version of a Windows-style client that actually did long file names. So I went to Book Buyers in Mountain View, if anyone knows it. It's still there on Castro Street. Probably the best computer bookshop in the Bay Area, even better than the new ones. Because I don't know whether you've noticed, but if you go there, reviewers tend to dump the review copies of books at Book Buyers once they've finished reviewing them. So you can sometimes pick up books at Book Buyers before they've actually hit the Barnes & Noble. Anyway, so I found a OS 2 1.0 programming manual. And in the OS 2 1.2 programming, 1.0 programming manual, it actually had a bunch of structures which explained when you were making system calls into the OS 2 kernel how you would get long file names back. And based on the earlier work of the protocol and looking at what they did, I thought, well, if they're being true to form, all they do is they linearize those structures directly onto the wire. So I just sat there and wrote a bunch of code over a few days in the Samba server. And it was one of those wonderful Zen-like moments of programming when, I fired up the Windows PC, connected to Samba on my Sun 386i, and everything just worked. I saw a complete directory of long file name support, and I thought, I'm done! Woohoo! It's fixed! I think the last patch we did to that code went in about 2 weeks ago, because we're still working on that stuff, making sure it works with OS 2, making sure that things fit within the packets, resume keys, resume handles, you name it, there's all sorts of crap in that code. So we're actually still working on that. And I think I gave this talk about a year ago, and it's still true that we're still working on it, which is kind of funny. But it felt really good at the time. So this was our first run-in with the law. I thought the law, and we won, actually. So there was a company called Syntax. Does anyone remember Syntax TotalNet Server? Ooh, yes. One unfortunate. So they had a Samba-based... They had a product that essentially was the same as Samba, but it was completely proprietary. I don't know. I think they'd started around the same time as us. But it was all their own code, and this was the one that most of the Unix vendors shipped as their Windows integration piece. And so they contacted us very politely, very nicely, and said, I'm sorry, but we have a trademark on the name SMB server. So this was the first time we got noticed by the commercial world. And they said, well, you're going to have to change your name. So in the grand Unix tradition, Tridge did a grep on the letters S, M, and B in user-dict words, and we found Samba and Salmonberry. And so we voted and decided to choose Samba. And funnily enough, about 5 or 6 years later, after we'd put Syntax out of business, which was kind of an unintended side effect, but everyone had gone over to using Samba at that time, the guy who had contacted us about the name, he ran across us and he said, that was the dumbest thing I ever did, because Samba's a much cooler name. And it really helped you guys with getting traction. So that's how we ended up with our name. So till about 96, everything was done out of Tridge's personal tree. There were no backups, really. There was no source code control. One bad disk could have ruined our whole day. Pretty much like Linus did. Everything was hand applied. You send it to Tridge, and because he's superhuman and he has no need for eating, sleeping, or holidays, usually the next day there would be a new version with your patch in it, which was kind of cool. And then eventually, after a couple of weeks, he'd say, well, we've got enough crap in there, let's do a new release. So that was about the extent of the QA that we would do. But it mostly worked. I mean, there was so much low-hanging fruit at that point that it was pretty easy to make great progress. And after a while, we decided that really we should have a little bit more structure of how the patches got applied, so that we could. I think we had a couple of early disasters where releases just broke completely, and we had to back some patches out. So we decided to move to CVS, which was the most popular version control system. And things got a lot more serious after that. John Terpstra actually suggested that we kind of form some kind of entity. And so what we did was we just started calling ourselves the Samba team. There was no formal, real formal announcement. There was no legal structure set up. Samba is kind of unique in many open source projects in that, I should say free software projects, because we're really a free software project, in that we never kind of went commercial. We're kind of like the Grateful Dead of the free software community, because we just kept doing our stuff without sort of signing on with the big record companies and getting a Samba.com and So it was just a bunch of guys. Unfortunately, no women, and it's still just a bunch of guys. Again, unfortunately, no women working on it. Actually, that's not true. Our new release manager is female. And so, yeah, we never put a structure around it like Apache. We never started a foundation. So it's very loose. Membership of the Samba team really means two things. Firstly, it means that you get direct commit access to the repositories, which is actually the real meaning of being in the Samba team. And the second thing is you get one of these T-shirts. Now, we sell the T-shirts without the word team underneath, so anyone can have those. But because we have this kind of special exclusive T-shirt deal, people will work enormous amounts of hours for free just to say, I'm a member of the Samba team, and get one of these T-shirts. So it's actually an immense motivator. Sort of the right level of exclusivity around a T-shirt can be really handy. So think about that the next time you're doing your corporate T-shirt run. Sort of have one version of the T-shirts with a mistake and only make 10 of them or something, and then give them out for exceptional services rendered. So around 1.6.9, 1.7 is when we started to get really popular, and it was noticeable. I mean, everybody was running it on Solaris and Sonos, but all of a sudden around that time, Tridge and I often joke about various vintages of Samba releases. I mean, I think one of our particular favorites was 1.6.9. That was that's a particularly good vintage. I think it was 1.6.18 was another that were particularly good releases that you will still find people out there running today. They may not know it because the damn thing just runs. So we started to get a little bit more serious about release and a little bit more serious about doing QAs. So we had some pre-releases around that time. And that was the first time somebody, and I'm not sure who it was, maybe John Terpstra, put together a Samba FAQ. And again, at that time, we added a security equals user model, which is pretty much the way most Windows servers work, Windows NT servers work, not the way old DOS servers worked. The old DOS servers, you would have a password protecting a share, but anyone who had that password had full rights to that share. With Windows NT and, of course, with Unix, and you have to authenticate as an incoming user. So we finally added that model around that time, which was a really big step forward in security. We actually always mapped incoming users to individual Unix users. It's just that it was a lot easier to do it with later versions of the protocol than earlier ones. So 1.8, we introduced share-level browsing. We added the IPC dollar share. We implemented a protocol called RAP, Remote Access Protocol, which is actually what Windows used to use. They don't anymore, but they used to use to display all the resources available on a machine and to do network neighborhood browsing. So at the time, I actually thought about setting up a company that would do nothing but fix people's network neighborhood browsing issues. Because A, no one understood how it works, and B, it was always broken. And we actually understood it, so we were like, I think we were like the only people outside of Microsoft who actually understood how this was supposed to work and could debug it on a network. So we got really popular. It turned out Windows integration was something that everybody kind of needed, because they were rolling out more Windows boxes. And we got our first kanji patches from Japan because, then we realized that there were people out there using the code who we'd never heard of, who had no contact with us, who were just taking it and using it, which was really great. I mean, that's what we wanted to happen, really. So what about Microsoft? So this was back in the 94 days. And they were actually extremely helpful to Samba in the early days. Now they're moving back in that direction again with a bit of a club, but and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm actually really, really pissed with Microsoft right now because of the OOXML thing, but I'll go into that later. But they were actually extremely helpful in those early days. So they saw Samba as a way to get Windows clients into Unix environments, and we kind of saw Samba as a way to keep Unix servers in existing Windows environments. I think they probably got the better deal out of it than we did. So it was probably a good idea for them to help us. But there are areas where Samba is still extremely popular. Mainly the embedded systems market, which we do quite well in. So Lee Fisher, who was one of the Microsoft evangelists, he gave Tridge a copy of the Xopen spec I'd had to pay $200 for. And he also arranged for Tridge and Volker to be flown first class, those were the days, to Redmond for the very first CIFS conference, which they ran about 94, 95. And it was kind of funny because we were actually going to do a demo to all the other engineers. There were engineers there from Sun, from Novell, from many other companies. And Microsoft were doing a big demo showing Samba connecting from Australia to a server on the Redmond campus. And unfortunately, the name they picked was 15 characters long, which actually pulled out a bug in the Windows name resolution code, even though it was a DNS name. If it was 15 characters exactly, it decided it was a NetBIOS name and started to try and look it up. So we fixed the demo like 10 minutes before we were about to do it by adding a dot on the end of the DNS name, which which made it 16 characters and therefore correctly resolved. So we didn't tell anyone else. So around this time, Sun... Does anyone remember Sun's Web NFS? Ha-ha! Oh, no, there is. Oh, a few sad people, yes. Yes, remember that one. That was going to be the file system for the Internet. So, of course, 20 minutes after Sun announced that, Microsoft said, we have one of those too. And so they renamed SMB into Common Internet File System, of which only one of those things was true. It was very common true. You would be insane to run it over the Internet, and it's not a file system. But hey, what the hell, it's marketing, right? And what we discovered was when they tried to push this onto the internet, which they don't do anymore. Oh no, it's definitely internet ready. It'll work. What they discovered was that they never actually test Windows servers against anything else than Windows clients. And so when you've got this insular environment where your clients are tested against your servers, you tend to miss things. So somebody discovered, because they made ftp.microsoft.com available via CIFS, and someone discovered that by connecting with SMB client, and I believe it was typing cd ... You would crash the machine, because you would basically run off the end of the stack. And they would do that repeatedly. Not me, I don't know who was doing it, but someone had a lot of fun with that, obviously. So they quickly rushed out a patch. These was in the old pre-security memo days. And it turned out that the patch that they had done was that they were specifically checking for the string ... which took about 15 minutes for someone to discover was the patch that was used, and they kept on crashing it until they decided to actually fix the path name validation code. So it took them a while to get that. And had they thought about security at that point, which was about 97, they could have saved themselves a lot of pain and effort going through that security revision stuff that they had to do later on. That was an early warning. So another pain, if anyone remembers, was that Samba couldn't do encrypted passwords. You had to send plain text passwords over the wire. And obviously, in the days of SSH, this is not a very good idea. So looking in the XOpen spec, it actually mentioned an 8-byte magic constant as part of the password validation algorithm, and that 8-byte magic constant was listed as 8 question marks. So, hey, we coded it up, we used 8 question marks, it didn't work. So, okay. It actually turns out that what that meant, and I found out from an XOpen person later, what that meant was that Microsoft refused to tell XOpen what that constant was. So XOpen, without actually saying, and ask Microsoft what the constant is, they just published the spec putting 8 question marks in there because they didn't know. Later on, and subsequently I found talking to Microsoft engineers that the reason that they didn't tell XOpen was because this was the old landman password hash based on a case-insensitive password, and they had been told by their lawyers that this was so insecure that if they published it, their users would sue them. Because it really wasn't much of a password at all. So I went up to a professional developers conference up in Redmond, and I kind of found some Microsoft engineers and talked to them, and they said, well, we'd like to tell you, but there's this problem, didn't tell me what it was straight away. And then they found me a Microsoft a marketing person who actually had the authority to let things be released, and I spent a long time explaining to her what it was I wanted and why I wanted it. And I'll never forget her response. Her response was a look of blank horror. And she just said to me, why do you want to hack into our systems? So sort of interoperability equals, breaking their security and hacking into their systems. So the very idea of interoperability was absolute abhorrence to them. Anyway, so it turned out, I don't know if this is on the next slide or... no, I shall go back. So actually what happened was it turned out that one of the engineers took pity on us and we asked him questions via email, and he sent responses back to us. Basically, he was acting dumb. And so he gave us the intermediate steps that meant that we could essentially run the algorithm backwards and work out what the initial magic constant was. So it took a little bit of computing time to do that, but we actually came up with a magic constant, which is like the first row of characters on one of the keyboards. It's not quite QWERTY, but it's kind of similar. We thought we were being terribly clever. until later on I ran into the guy and he's like, man, it took you guys ages to get that. I was trying to leak it to you about every way I could, and God, it took you about a month, and all of a sudden I stopped feeling very clever and started feeling extremely stupid. So, because I mean the engineers, we always get on real well with the engineers at Microsoft, and they've always wanted to help Samba and interoperate because hey, they're just engineers like everyone else, and they want stuff to work. So. So Tridge finally got told by his supervisor that if he didn't finish his thesis, they were going to throw him out. So he, around that time, I was actually offered the first full-time job to work on Samba at a little company called Whistle Communications. Anyone remember Whistle? Ah, yes. So Whistle was a great company. It had this product called the Interjet, which allowed, it was kind of a pun on the inkjets, but for the internet. Had Apple UI designers. So this is just a warning. If I ever join your company, you should run for the hills. Because my business sense is completely lacking. I had job offers from both Whistle to work on Samba and also from a small company producing a completely generic Linux box with no extra value add, nothing that would make it successful whatsoever, called Cobalt Microsystems. So what we at Whistle failed to realize was that Cobalt had a blue plastic box with a glowing light. Never underestimate the power of a really cool blue plastic box with a glowing light. Those things sold just, they couldn't keep them on the shelves, whereas the Interjet won awards in all the magazines and was once very nastily described as the nicest box you couldn't buy, because we tried to sell it through ISPs, who of course, ISPs can't even sell internet service, for Christ's sake. They couldn't sell, expecting them to sell another product was insane. Anyway, so long story short, I did talk about this in one of my columns called The Startup Bicycle. They crushed us. They got bought by Sun for like $6 billion or something, and we all ended up pouring on the street after being bought by IBM, which is kind of a fate worse than death, really. Anyway, a little aside there about the Valley. So I took over the Samba release process as part of Whistle, and I'm a lot more conservative than Tridge was, because I wasn't just throwing stuff out over the wall. I actually tried to do QA because I had paying customers on the Interjet actually expecting this stuff to work. So now it's my job. Someone has to make this crap work, unfortunately. We can't just say, hey, what the hell, it's free software. We threw it over the wall. It works, so it doesn't, give us a patch. I had people paying me to do this, so I had to do the internationalization stuff right. I had to write documentation. There are a bunch of new features that got added at that time. I was at Whistle when I first did the opportunistic locking support. I'm not going into the technical part of that, but it's actually the thing that made Samba competitive with Microsoft Windows. Without oplocks, we were slower. With oplocks, all of a sudden, we got really, really fast. So Samba had kind of become business at that point. But it was still fun to work on. So here's something we don't talk about much. There's a little picture of Gollum in the corner. A bunch of bastards down in Texas, I believe. No, it was either LA or Texas, somewhere around there. Kind of similar. They basically stole the Samba source code, removed our copyright, as I said, in crayon, and then they tried to sell it to a major Unix vendor. Is it safe to name them yet? Probably not. Yeah, I know. Don wants me to name them so that he can get me in trouble again. No, I'm not going to name. Let's just say a major Unix vendor decided to buy this thing for about $5 million, mainly because it was much, much faster than Syntax. And the amusing thing was, they were running tests. They complained that it was too slow. I put the oplock code into the Samba code. A week later, these criminals delivered a new version of their product that was like 10 times faster because they'd just basically stolen all the oplock code I'd just put in there. Unbelievable stupidity, and a bunch of friends that I have in Unix vendors who are a little bit wary about these guys because they, like I said, they appeared off the back of a truck in Texas somewhere saying, hey, we have software. Somebody sent me the binaries and said, can you check that this is Samba? And I ran NM on the binaries, and there was a complete match. Every single function name. Oh, and to add insult to injury, they'd added a license manager. This is the... So at that point, we registered our copyright at the Library of Congress so that we could seek criminal damages, because we were really pissed. Oh, the other thing about these geniuses was that they were doing their... first of all, they claimed... We tried to contact them, like we do, in a friendly way, saying, hang on a minute, we think you're violating our license, let's talk about this. And their initial responses, of course, were lies, obfuscation, threatening to sue. I mean, the usual sort of tactics of the kind of person who really would be happier breaking into your car and stealing your radio rather than doing software. They had one guy who was actually... they had their one technical guy who was basically obfuscating the software. And we know this because they were doing all their work on an SGI IRIX box with a public NFS share exported to the internet. So like every evening, Tridge and I would log on, download all their latest changes, just we worked out what the UID was, just connected to it, and basically we're collecting evidence and burning it to CDs, so when this went to trial, because, like I say, these were morons. And finally they gave in and they went back to selling, $3,000 toilets to the Defense Department or whatever it was they were doing before. That was kind of the business they were in. And the vendor concerned got so burned by that, because I don't think they got their money back, that they ran away from free software for about another 5 to 6 years after that. And in fact are still unbelievably hostile to free software to this day, whilst masking it all in we're so free software friendly veneer. But anyway, like I say, I'm not naming them right now. Oh, and about that time, Tridge came to visit me in the Valley, and I think it was Hummingbird Software who had the PCNFS sort of... They invited him to come chat to them and said, "Whoa, it's a nice toy you've got there. Do you want to sell it to us for, say, $40 million?" To which Tridge quite honestly said, "I'm sorry, I don't own it," which is true. But like I said, there's no Samba.com. So this is when the trouble started, really, which kind of led to the EU case and a bunch of other things. So at the CIFS conference in Santa Cruz in, I think it was 95, or it could have been 97, the one that the old non-insane SCO ran, we obviously had ACLs on Unix system, or at least we had user group and world, and we wanted to show Windows clients who owned those files. That's all we wanted to do. It's like... it's like somebody looking at the nuclear blast crater and saying, but all we wanted to do was to show the ACLs. And it turns out that Microsoft had tied getting the owner of a file to everything else, basically. If you could do that, essentially that simple query of who owns this file turned out to involve implementing DCERPC, name pipe support, hundreds and hundreds of interfaces that was the core of the Windows domain architecture. So we kind of said, well, why don't you just add us a call that says who owns these files? And like, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that. We're not going to change our software. So his exact words were, we will never release this information. We consider this our proprietary advantage. So this kind of pissed off a bunch of Samba team people. So Luke Layton and Paul Ashcroft, neither of whom work on Samba anymore, they decided to work it out. And they were pretty smart. So once they started figuring that out, they began to realize that this was tied into the entire Windows domain system, which is about the last thing that Microsoft ever wanted us to work on. So eventually ended up with them announcing, we have domain controller support in Samba, like 7 months later. So, that was just kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So after Whistle melted down, I went to join SGI. And SGI was serious about performance. So they were the first vendor. Herb Lewis, who's still a member of the Samba team, works in a Parnassus down there in the valley. He basically lobbied and got me on board at SGI, and we were attached to the NFS team, which shows what the priorities were. But they dropped syntax, and I don't know whether you remember, but SGI at that time, apart from being like the coolest company to work for in the valley, because it was like It was basically it was my second best job. The best job I've ever had is at a university where I didn't have to turn up until 10 a.m. every morning. SGI, everything you did was just cool. It was a wonderful place to work. Nobody gave a damn about those stupid sales and marketing people, as you may have noticed. But they were serious about performance. So they added opportunistic locking support to the kernel. They said, we're shipping on 64-bit boxes. Our vendors, our customers have big files. And by big, 2 gigabytes is like a Word file. Just go fix it, make it work properly. So that was when Samba really got some serious code work done on it. We got 64-bit clean, we got ACL support, we got pluggable, selectable internationalization so we could sell anywhere in the world. And then they said, well, we can't sell this stuff without documentation, and you're the only one who knows what all the options mean, so finish the man pages. So for about 3 months, I did nothing but write smb.conf man page options. So if any of them are really bad, you can blame me at that point. And then SGI finally published, because SGI at that time was selling Windows NT clients, and they wanted IRIX servers to serve them, so they bought a bunch of Windows NT clients, stocked up the lab with them, and we did a benchmark on gigabit. And we were fast. We were really fast. We were the world's fastest Windows server, basically. And at that point, something interesting happened. So the story is that, which I believe from a Microsoft guy, that Bill Gates storms into the Windows lab with I think it was InfoWeek or whatever at the time, and said, "What's this? Fix it. Make sure we're better." And he was really pissed about it. So unfortunately, rather than fixing the code, what they did was they hired an independent vendor called Minecraft that they were hiring to prove this. Well, if you're doing Samba, why don't we try and get rid of all this free software crap at the same time? So let's do a benchmark on Apache as well. And I think they might have done MySQL or something. So they proved that Windows Server was faster than Linux with Samba and Apache. And unfortunately, the vendor that they chose, while being very compliant, had absolutely no hardware or engineers. So Microsoft donated the hardware and engineers in their lab. Wasn't that kind of them? And so I remember actually talking with the guy after they published it, and it was really funny because I would call the number, and he would give me this number here in the Valley, and he would call me back. He would never, ever answer the phone. He would call me back, and the number he was calling back for would show up on SGI's caller ID as a Washington Redmond number. and he would swear blind that he was in his lab in the Valley. It was really quite pathetic. And they tried to publish this as independent, and it was one of the first times that the media basically just said to Microsoft, bollocks. They didn't believe him, and it was the first of the many media revolutions against Microsoft that produced people like Stephen Vaughan Nichols and Mary Jo Foley. And when they finally realized that they were being lied to, and they were kind of pissed off about it. It was IT Week. So let's see. Yeah, we started getting a reasonable number of books published at the time. Some of them good, some of them bad. Jerry's book was probably the best at the time. John Blair published the first book on Samba, and I promised I would do a speaking tour in computer literacy in the Valley to try and advertise it for him. The really funny thing is they scheduled me at the same time as Linus's very first kernel talk to the Silicon Valley Users Group, which I really wanted to go see. So I'm stood there in computer literacy with like 15 people, holding up the book, and I said, look, Linus is giving a talk just down the road. Shall we all go? You don't want to hear this Samba talk, do you? And unfortunately, about 10 of them said, no, we really want to hear about Samba. So I was stuck. I had to give the bloody talk. Anyway, so that wasn't a very good book, by the way. But so Jerry did a much better one. Jerry joined the Samba team from Audubon University, give us some southern charm. He ends up becoming the release maintainer, which he is for 3.0. Chris writes implementing CIFs to actually document everything we know about the protocol. And John Terpstra starts to maintain the official documentation and publishes it under Bruce Perrin's series. He did an immense amount of work for that. They're actually pretty good books. They really, really worked hard to get those out. And the great thing was he made them all available under an open license so that they were available for anyone to print in any country. So we had our first fork. Disagreements with Luke. If anyone knows Luke, I can tell you the stories later. But first of all, I'm sorry. But the second thing is I can tell you the stories later. Luke basically wants to turn Samba into Windows, and we really didn't want to do that. There's various architectural decisions that it turns out there's some very great advantages to a monolithic architecture. Especially with speed and especially on Unix boxes. Turns out that not everything is really fast when you multi-thread it. And the great thing was IBM, bless their little cotton socks, they were completely honest. They had a research project that produced a threaded SMB server, and they turned up at one of the CIFS conferences and said, yes, we thought this was going to kick Samba's ass, we thought it was going to be great. We ran it, and at 15 clients it died. It basically it choked up on its own locking and was completely screwed. So Tridge and I basically got more and more pissed fixing bugs in Luke's code and fixing the security holes in Luke's code. And basically, he finally encouraged Luke to leave and form a new project called Samba TNG, the next generation. And it died, basically. Slowly, quietly, smothered in the crib or whatever, but nobody worked on it. So, which is the fate of most forks. So at that time, hey, there was the Linux Care Party. Who was at the Linux Care Party in Linux World 2001? Anyone? Man, that was a great party, wasn't it, Don? I'm sorry. For all you guys, you missed a great party. Those guys spent VC's money like it wasn't even theirs. Strange thing. And everybody got hired. Outrageous salaries. Man, if you could spell the word web, you could spell web, you're hired. Pets.com. You remember those days. So we all worked at VA, open source, and sort of like, let's kick that dirty hippie Stallman under the carpet because he scares people. Oh, it's open source now, not free software. Poor Richard. Became cool and hip. And at that point, VA was interested in doing appliances or a lot of Samba development. Basically, everybody got hired full-time to work on Samba because, hey, it was open source, it was cool. We were going to make money somehow, nobody knew how, but hey, that doesn't matter. And then, of course, 2000 happens, everyone gets fired. So as I like to joke, Larry Augustin is the only person who's ever laid me off. I'll never forgive him for it, but what can you do? So he's still a venture capitalist, and I still work gigs like this for a living, so what can you do? So we ended up... got some strange shadows. We ended up all going to HP, all except for Tridge, because HP couldn't work out how to pay him in US dollars. So they offered him a very generous 30% pay cut, which he politely declined, and he ended up at Quantum instead. So HP had a really, really cool idea, which, anyway, I still think is the best business opportunity, one of the best business opportunities that HP screwed up. I mean, you can there's probably a long list of wonderful business opportunities that HP has screwed up, but I think this one must rank near the top of them. So we created a print appliance. We put about 10 person-years of code in fixing the print driver download infrastructure in Samba. And we had a box for which the cost of goods was about $500, which we sold for $5,000, which would outperform a Windows print server running on a gigahertz processor with a gig of RAM. They couldn't process the number of print jobs that we did. So we're very happy about that. TDB, Samba was becoming very successful. Unfortunately, after about 3 years, HP had a reorganization, and we ended up we had plans for that. We had plans for that product. The plan was that we were going to turn this into a platform. It was Linux-based. We were going to open it up so that third-party print vendors could add things into the print path. And at that point, HP would have owned printing, basically, just completely. As soon as it left the Windows client, HP would have owned it. And so I remember giving this pitch to the new VP, who it turned out was in charge of the Microsoft relationship for HP print drivers. And so 2 weeks later, we were told that we were cancelled and everyone had to work on a new Windows-based print product instead, which 2 years later was quietly drowned in the bathtub and never saw the light of day. The HP print server appliance was so popular that one of the customers, to this day, still runs them and offers Jerry ludicrous amounts of money to fly out and fix bugs in the code, and really sort of contacted HP to say, how much would you sell us this product for? So sort of the code and the hardware to build it. But HP wasn't selling. Anyway. Samba 3.0 got released. Okay. So, global thermonuclear monopoly. Things got ugly. So there was the Department of Justice case that we kind of sat out and watched from the sidelines. But then when the new administration came in and found that there wasn't a billionaire that they didn't like and kind of dropped all charges, the EU case started up. And Volker and I were involved in that pretty much from the beginning. And basically I was still working at HP at the time, and I was talking to my boss and I said, I'm kind of probably going to get involved in this. And he said, find yourself a conference that's going on in Europe around the same time. I will pay the expenses for the conference. Don't tell me what you're doing. which I thought was fair. So we ended up, Volker and I represented the Free Software Foundation in Europe at the Brussels hearing. Things did not go well for Microsoft. So this is why, if I was up against anyone, I would fear Microsoft's lawyers much more than Microsoft's lawyers. I would fear IBM's lawyers much more than Microsoft's lawyers. Because Microsoft's lawyers are kind of crap. And the classic one there was, in the hearing, in the morning, Microsoft had their presentation, and one of the things that they said was, no one has ever asked us for protocol interoperability information. Simply, no one has asked us. We have no records of this. This is simply a dead issue, that this is a non-issue that no one is interested in. Unfortunately, the guy who was saying that was a VP called Rob Short. And I was sat there on my laptop with Volker with my entire Microsoft archives, and Tridge and I had an email exchange with a guy at Microsoft called Rob Short, asking for protocol information, to which he said, we're not going to give it you. So the afternoon session, when we came to present, we had printed out like 500 copies of this email exchange, and it was available on everybody's chair when they came back from lunch. So in the end, they got fined 650 million, I think euros actually, that should have been, and told to release the protocol spec, and they said, bollocks, we're not doing it. And they appealed. We're not going to release it until we lose. Okay. So at this time, we started getting more interested in the protocol itself. And HP and SCO had done some extensions to the SMB protocol to make it work Unix to Unix, basically. And so Steve French is implementing CIFS-FS in the kernel. James Peach and George Collier are doing the same in the Apple Mac OS X kernel. Sun, I believe, is now doing a similar thing. And I implement the server piece of it. And so basically we now have Unix to Unix CIFS working about as well as NFS does, certainly better than NFS v4. And we've added things like on-the-wire encryption, large packet support, and it's actually pretty cool. This is one of the things I'm going to be talking about in the conference next week. And so at this point, you can actually have diskless Linux workstations running SMB and CIFS, just like you used to have with NFS. And what's more importantly, it becomes really viable to put Linux workstations into a Windows-only network, and they just work. So Samba 3 is successful as an old NT4 domain controller. I'm sorry, I'm running a little long, so please, cut me short if you're fed up. It mostly works well, but it's really outdated now. Since 2000, I mean, it's been 8 years. They've been Active Directory. So we interoperate with Active Directory, but we can't replace it. So Tridge basically decides a new approach is needed to fix this problem. So what he realizes is that essentially the SMB protocol written down is useless. Because you can implement a perfect server, and if it doesn't have exactly Windows semantics, and by exactly I mean when the timestamps change on the files as you're accessing them, what Windows does is the only spec. So he starts writing a new client library that will actually run as a test and actually test every single variant that you can do. So he'll query the timestamps, all the 7 different ways that you can, and make sure that they match. And you can run this against any server. So what we end up with is a test suite called SMB Torture that you can actually run against Windows. And of course, Windows by definition passes because that was what we developed it against. And then you run it against Samba, and any difference that you get shows a bug. And it turns out that actually that's true. And it also shows us that the Windows SMB server is essentially a very thin shim living on top of the NTFS file system semantics. So what we're actually discovering is many of the NTFS file system semantics. And this becomes the core of the Samba 4 code. So Tridge goes to IBM in the research department and starts working on the Samba 4 code base. But this is an immense task, some of which some design decisions of which I disagree with, I'll be honest. And they decide to do everything themselves, including integrating the Heimdall Kerberos, doing the connectionless LDAP server, everything. It's still in the experimental stage. They're coming out with alphas. We're changing Samba 3.2 to be more compartmentalized so that it will be able to talk with the Samba 4 backend. But right now, the Samba 3.2 code essentially is the robust production level stuff. Samba 4 is still experimental. So what we're doing is, as we learn things in Samba 4, we're rapidly porting that code back into Samba 3. If anyone were to push me and say, when's Samba 4 going to be done? I would probably say what will eventually happen is there'll be some horrible hybrid of the Samba 3 and Samba 4 code that will end up as the actual Samba 4 product. I don't know when that will be done. So here's a slide just for Ted. So Novell decides to leave the free software community and do a patent cross-licensing deal with Microsoft, except that they think they can get around it by calling it a covenant not to sue, not a cross-licensing deal. And a few smaller vendors have followed. Now what this did, interestingly enough, was it really spurred the GPL v3 efforts to finish it up, to close out this, what they believe was a loophole. I'm still not sure whether it was actually a loophole or not, whether if anyone had sued Novell over this, they would have won in court. It turns out that I think essentially the Free Software Foundation decided not to do that. What they decided to do was to use it as a spur to adopt the GPL v3. And in fact, Samba 3.2 has moved to GPL v3, and many, many other projects have followed to prevent things like this happening. Yeah? So the question is, how did we contact people and get the permission to move to v3? Well, it's actually extremely simple, because Samba is under the license terms GPL v2 or later. So essentially, we don't need anyone's permission to move the code. I mean, obviously we got everybody on the Samba team on board, and that was, there were some pretty interesting arguments about that internally. But when you have a or later clause in the license, you're free to move at any time. And that's why our GPL v3 code is under GPL v3 or later. I actually had an interesting conversation with a Microsoft guy about this. And he was saying, well, why were you guys so pissed? And we kind of said, well, look, imagine that someone had found a loophole in Microsoft's end-user license agreement. And what they discovered is by using this loophole, they could make free copies of Windows and sell them at full price and not give Microsoft a dime. What would you guys do about that? Would you go, oh man, that's clever. Yeah, wow, I really admire your legal ingenuity. Oh, damn, yeah, we're stuck. There's nothing we can do about that. Or would you go, you bastards, we're going to change the license to close that. And, when I kind of explained that, they were like, well, yeah, okay, GPL v3 makes sense then, I suppose. Yeah, no shit. Anyway, so Microsoft loses the appeal. The EU brings the hammer down on them. And they agreed to comply and actually release all of the protocol documentation. And they actually have to start writing some of it, because not all of it's there. They still are fixing some of it up. And then the interesting thing happened. They contacted the Samba team and asked to negotiate terms. That was weird. We were paranoid for about 2 months. I mean, this was weird. I mean, we were used to talking to Microsoft programmers, no problem. Microsoft lawyers? This was just... And they were being nice to us. I mean, really nice. This was weird. This was creepy. So, we end up doing a deal. Have we done the right thing? So I always used to joke... Whenever I would always used to laugh at companies who would do these deals with Microsoft saying, oh, yes, we're Microsoft's preferred new, whatever. And then, like, 3 years later when they're going out of business and suing Microsoft for violating the deal, I would always go, ha, ha, from The Simpsons and essentially go, well, what did you expect? You did a deal with them. And my philosophy was just never, ever deal with them. Just don't deal with them, never, ever. Just stay away from it. And yet we ended up doing a deal. Well, why? Well, if you examine it really carefully, it turns out that it does help Samba, especially with the patent threats. We actually have some commitments on patents that no one else has. And that alone is enough for us to do the deal. And the interesting thing is, what we were very frightened of, because the negative side of the deal was we were told we had to keep the protocol information completely secret. So, hey, at least it taught me how to set up TrueCrypt on my laptop to set up an encrypted partition. So we were very frightened. There were very strict penalty terms if that information had leaked from the Samba team. So we were kind of cautious about who got hold of it. 2 months later, Microsoft released all that information publicly. So the great thing is now we have this deal that gives us some favorable patent terms, and yet the possible penalty clause has completely gone away. Because another part of the deal said if this information was released by Microsoft, essentially all the penalties that we would have for releasing it would disappear. So, yeah, it still remains to be seen if we've done the right thing. And I do worry about that quote. I still worry about that quote. But on the whole, we think it's going well at the moment. So as I said, Microsoft released all the protocol information publicly. And I think you can do two things. You can say, bravo, well done, you finally tried to help people. And, I was quite positive about it until the OXML thing. And then I thought, well, actually, no, all that's happened is that they've realized the control point has moved from the technical trade secret information. The control point has moved to the patents. So, there's still a measure of control around this, but now the control is, well, you can't implement this because if you do, you might be violating a patent. To be honest, I think that's a lot less, I think that's a lot weaker control point than hiding the technical information. Hiding the technical information is actually pretty effective. It takes a particular kind of mind, and it's quite hard to reverse engineer that stuff to work it out. Network analysis is what we do. Sort of legal threats are much weaker, to be honest. I mean, hands up, who seriously thinks that Microsoft is going to sue Linux-using customers? I mean, they would be insane, because every Linux-using customer is a Microsoft customer. Actually, is that true? Is there anyone here who uses no Microsoft products whatsoever? You should be worried. Actually, I'm much nicer. The last time I did that and someone put their hand up, I said, move out of your parents' basement. But but no, I mean, it's very unlikely that they're going to sue anyone over this. This is just my opinion. So, I was actually feeling quite positive about Microsoft until the OOXML war started. And I think all I can do for this slide is, there's the actual reference called Microsoft Great Besmirching. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to read a journalist quote on this, Glyn Moody. And I want everybody to listen to this, and I want everybody to remember it, especially the Microsoft guys in the audience. But if the whole sorry OOXML saga shows anything, it is Microsoft's deep and utter contempt for the whole idea of an open, collaborative process based on mutual respect and consensus. Henceforth, members of the open source community must view with deep cynicism all, not just some, offers by Microsoft to work more closely with the free software world. If they don't, they could find themselves used and abused, just like the once famous and now former International Standards Organization. So I would remember that when Microsoft turn up and say, but we've changed. No, really, we mean it this time. We've changed. Anyway, I've given them enough of a kicking. I actually gave the poor guys who are coming to Germany next week a bit of a kicking over this, so they know what my feeling is on this. Having said that, we'll still cooperate and we'll still collaborate with them on the protocols, but, you know, I'm under no illusion that that's being done because the EU has mandated that it be done. So, anyway, and on that note, will people keep upgrading to Windows? Is there an alternative? Desktop Linux? I'm out of time, which is good because I'm just finishing up. I have hopes. I mean, the number of macOS laptops in one way is very depressing because it's still closed source software. But in another way, it's kind of heartening that people actually do perceive that there is an alternative. Okay, so that's it. And nobody really asked a question. You boring bastards. So has anyone got any questions or comments now, or am I standing between you and lunch? Yes, Don. Oh, sorry, the question is, are we still using CVS? No, we changed from CVS to Subversion, and we did that while I was on a plane to Samba XP a few years ago. So I turned up, tried to update my repository, and everything was broken. And the bastards didn't even tell me. So this time, they changed to Git. And when they changed to Git, Jerry was behind it, and I told him, I said, Jerry, I'm going to use Git just like I use Subversion. I know I shouldn't, but I have more important things to do than learn source code control systems. So if I have any problems with Git, I have your number, and I'm going to call. So for 2 weeks, I actually made his life pretty much a living hell. But we're kind of over that now. And everybody mostly likes Git, apart from it being the most user-hostile piece of software in the world. I mean, it's like sticking your hand into a bag of kicked ferrets, you know? Sometimes you may come out with a ferret. Mostly you're going to get your hand torn to shreds. But yeah, any other questions? Oh, yes. What do I think of the OXML standard? We don't have enough time to go into what I think of the OXML standard. Very briefly, I had to study OXML as part of my job. I've been lobbying against it. OXML is MSDN quality documentation. You know, if you've used MSDN, you know what I mean. It looks like it's complete, but it's fuzzy on the details. You get into the details, it doesn't work. It is not implementable by anyone else but Microsoft. I mean, it's another treadmill. It essentially is a mapping of the binary documents. It's another treadmill that Microsoft controls the throttle on, and they will rev it up. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Patrick Durisso. Is it Drusso? Do you know? Yeah. Patrick Durisso. I'm not going to... Yeah. I'm not going to answer that. What I would suggest that you do is look at Rob Weir's blog about Patrick and why he said what he said. Rob knows a lot more than he's saying, and I know a lot more than I'm able to say on that matter. But yeah, it's not as obvious as it seems. Yeah. So the question is, should non-Samba team members stay away from the documentation? I don't think so. No, I really don't. To be honest, I think it's pretty much a free-for-all. I would, I would encourage people to actually download it and look at it. If you are worried about it, join the Samba Programming Freedom Information Foundation. If you are an open source programmer, one of the things that Tridge and I realized is that now that they've released these specs, there's absolutely no reason why we can't sign up any open source developer into the Programming Freedom Information Foundation, and then you get the same patent protections that we've got. So the question is, the comment is, some of that's not about SMB. Yes, but actually the stuff that was released to the Samba team, what we should probably do is, and we'll talk with Microsoft next week about this, is release a list of the document names that were released to us under the PFIF information, because it was much more than just the SMB stuff, right? So what I'm saying is those documents are under the patent protections that we have, and therefore, if you join the PFIF, then you will get the same patent protections that we have. Documents that are outside that are a little more risky because of the patent issues. But to be honest, Microsoft and the patents don't frighten me at all. They really don't. The likelihood of them actually suing, they'll make lots of threats, but the likelihood of them actually suing someone is so far remote that I think you can essentially ignore it. This is my opinion. I am not a lawyer. If you get sued, don't blame me. Sorry.